Okay, so time's up. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. So I really welcome all of you to this event. Let me begin with our event. So I'm Hong Bo-shim, the director of this center. And let me begin with some introduction of this lecture series, Wook Hyun Kwon lecture series. So first, let me introduce Professor Wook Hyun Kwon. So he, as you know, he is a professor at Seoul National University from 1977 to 2008. And after his retirement at 2008, he became a chair professor at Digist, and he served as a chair professor for 2010 to 2014. His major field is actually, as you see here, sorry about this, as you see here, predictive control and receding horizon control, time delay system, and the finite impulse response filtering, and real-time computer application for automation. I'm sorry, I'm not used to this device. And then he actually supervised 113 graduate students, and also he published many journals, 150 international journal paper. And in particular, he authored 2 books. One is Receding Horizon Control, and the other one is about the time-delayed system. He is a fellow of National Academy of Engineering in Korea, and also a fellow of Korea Academy of Science and Technology, and he is fellow of IEEE and IFAC, which is the International Federation of Automatic Control, and TWAS, what is that? Sorry about this. The World Academy of Science for Developing Countries. And he was the former president of IFAC and ICROS, which is the Institute of Control and Robotics and System, and the Korea Institute of Electrical Engineering, and vice president of the NAEK and the KAST. He is actually a strong motivator of entrepreneurship. So actually 10 startups by his student is already developed, and 7 out of them, out of which already went to the stock market, the co-stock. Okay, so in order to honor Professor Kwon's lifetime influence and contribution to the community, this series of lectures was initiated in 2016. And every year, a person who made a great contribution to the system and control area is invited and asked to deliver a lecture. And this lecture is then recorded and broadcast online to the public in order to distribute to the knowledge and wisdom of the invited speaker. This event is actually made possible through the donation by Professor Kwon and his former student. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of them for their endowment. So I hope and believe that this lecture series continues delivery of the knowledge and wisdom of the invited speaker to the young researchers of the next generation, so that they will also contribute to the community and the world in the near future. This event is actually organized and managed by this center, so Engineering Research Center for Advanced Control and Instruments. And this center was founded by Professor Kwon in 1991, and it was one of the most successful ERC. And this center is now working for education and propagation of the knowledge, and if you are interested, please visit this website. Finally, we are proud of a member of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, which has served industry and academic community for more than 70 years. Now I would like to introduce the head of our ECE department, who is Professor Byung-ho Lee. So, thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Byung-ho Lee, as introduced. Actually, this is my first time to visit this seminar room. It's a very wonderful place. Good afternoon, distinguished participants and guests, Professor Wook Hyun Kwon and Professor Stephen Boyd. I'm indeed honored and delighted to be here today, and on behalf of the School of Electrical and Computer Engineering of Seoul National University, I would like to extend a wholehearted welcome to all participants and congratulate the Wook Hyun Kwon lecture. Dr. Kwon, Professor Emeritus of Seoul National University, has been our role model, like a shining light. He has encouraged his students to make startup companies even much earlier than the startup booming in Korea. His former students made 10 companies, among which we can find very successful companies today, like Humex and Suprema. Academically, it is amazing that his paper published in 2001 in International Journal of Control is one of the most highly cited papers among all papers published from our department up to date. More than that, Professor Kwon has served as the president of the International Federation of Automatic Control. He was the first professor in the history of our department who served as the president of International Society. Professor Kwon has been pursuing for contribution in academia even after his retirement. He recently published 2 books. One is Stabilizing and Optimizing Control for Time Delay Systems, published by Springer. And the other one is a translated book of digital signal processing using MATLAB for undergraduate student education. Therefore, in the sense, Wook Hyun Kwon lecture series has a very special meaning for us. And it is our great pleasure and honor to have as the invited distinguished lecturer, Professor Stephen Boyd from Stanford University. I believe that Professor Kwon will introduce Professor Boyd, but in fact, he does not need any introduction. Actually, some years ago, he was invited to SNU for assessment of our department and gave much advice for improving our department. I'd like to thank Professor Boyd, Professor Kwon, and also appreciate all efforts of Professor Hyung-bo Shim and the Engineering Research Center for Advanced Control and Instrumentation for this lecture series and arranging this wonderful opportunity of learning from Professor Boyd. I sincerely hope all participants enjoy this very meaningful occasion. Thank you very much.
Okay, next, Professor Kwon is coming to the podium, and he is going to introduce Professor Boyd.
Dear friend, it's my great honor to introduce Professor Stephen Boyd of Stanford University. Professor Boyd received a Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics from Harvard University in 1980, and a PhD in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science from UC Berkeley in 1985. He holds honorary doctorate from Rollard Institute of Technology and Catholic University of Rwanda. In 1985, he joined the faculty of Stanford Electrical Engineering Department. He is the Sampson Professor of Engineering since 2001. At Stanford, he has served as Director of Information System Laboratory, all you know, for 10 years, and as a member of the university level advisory board of 2 years. He has held various visiting positions in many universities. I'm not going to list it. His current research focus on convex optimization, especially application to engineering problem. Professor Boyd is author of many research articles and 3 books. He has been invited to deliver more than 90 plenary and keynote speeches in major conferences in control, optimization, signal processing, and now the machine learning. Total Google citation reached around 140,000. This amazing number, which is the highest in control community, and maybe the highest in Stanford University. His book, Convex Optimization, Google citation has about around 42,000, and linear matrix inequality in system and control theory, about 22,000 citations. His group has produced several open source tools, including Cvx, a widely used parser solver for convex optimization. His website, which makes available past paper, books, software, lecture note, and selected lecture video, is visited more than 1.3 billion per year. It's amazing. First of all, it has received many awards and honor for its excellent research. I will just name a few. He received American Control Council Donald P. Ekman Award, which is given for the greatest contribution to the field of control engineering by somebody under the age of 35, which means he was already excellent when he was young. Bill Orchard Hay Award from Mathematical Optimization Society in 2012, which is given every 3 years for excellence in computational mathematical programming. And finally, the ITP Control System Award in 2013, which is the top award given from ITP Control Community, Control Society. In 1991, he was elected as Fellow of IEEE, and also SIAM informs, finally, very distinguished US National Academy of Engineering. This is the top goal for the researcher in US, and a foreign member of Chinese Academy of Engineering. Professor Boyd is especially interested in education, undergraduate and graduate education. For example, his graduate course on convex optimization is attracting around 300 students from about 25 departments. It's just amazing. From this contribution, he received many awards for education. For example, in 1991, he received the Art and Science Student Union Graduate Teaching Award. In 1994, the Perrin Award for Outstanding Undergraduate Teaching in the School of Engineering. In 2003, he received the American Automatic Control Ragazine Education Award. In 2016, Walter J. Corr Award is the highest award for teaching at Stanford. And finally, in 2017, last year, James M. Morgan Jr. Education Award, the highest award in whole IEEE. As you see, Professor Boyd is a truly outstanding researcher and educator. I really appreciate he accepted to come to this lecture. Let's welcome Professor Boyd.
Well, thank you very much. I'm actually very, very happy to be here. I'm very grateful to the committee for selecting me. And not just because I have been coming to Korea, I think since the early 90s. I haven't figured out the first time, but maybe in the early 90s. So I always loved that. I love coming to Seoul. I love coming to Seoul National University. But I'm especially happy to be part of a lecture honoring Professor Kwon, who is, I think, a perfect model for everything from research, outreach, encouraging entrepreneurship among students. So I'm very, very happy to be here. Okay, so today I'm going to give an overview talk. And for the first maybe 10, 15 minutes, there'll be no equations. So it's just we're going to just talk about optimization and what's the idea. I'll try to use this one. Hopefully this will work. Aha, okay, good. So we'll start by just talking about mathematical optimization. And then at a very high level, like what do you use it for? What are the broad areas you use it for? Then we'll talk briefly about convex optimization. We'll look at a couple of simple examples, and then I'll cover two topics which are more research-oriented. They're more recent. One is on real-time embedded optimization, and the other is on large-scale distributed optimization. That'll be the last topic. Now, these are actually relatively recent research topics, but they are things that many people have been working on for a very long time, and I'll say something about that when we get there. Okay, so the first we're going to talk about is optimization. So what is optimization? Well, it's a problem that looks like this. Your job is to choose the value of this variable x. That's your job, is to choose a value for it. There's an objective. We're going to minimize it. You could also maximize it, but we're going to minimize it just to pick a standard. And there will be constraints. And the constraint says that if any of these constraints is violated, then x is unacceptable. Okay, so this is the idea. These are the inequality constraint functions. That's the objective. That's the equality constraint functions. Now, there are many variations on this problem. For example, you could maximize. You can have multiple objectives. But the truth is, if you know how to solve this one problem, you can handle any of these variations. So we're going to focus on just this one problem here. Okay. Now we're going to just talk for a while about what are the different classes of applications in optimization. Well, the most obvious one is it's about making good or the best choices or good actions. And so in this class of applications, X represents an action, something that actually happens. For example, if you're doing portfolio optimization, when you find out what X is, it tells you what should you buy and what should you sell. That's trades. In control, X might represent a vector of control surface deflections or a sequence of them over time. It could represent a schedule or an assignment. It could represent a resource allocation. How at a data center, for the next 10 seconds, should you allocate I/O bandwidth, memory, numbers of cores, amount of memory, this type of thing. Or it could actually be something like a transmitted signal. So in all of these cases, when you choose X, something happens, and it's related to X. Now, what the constraints do is they tell you what's possible, and they also impose conditions on the outcome. And the idea for the objective is the smaller this is, the better. And typical examples would be things like total cost or negative profit. It could be deviation from a desired or target outcome, risk, or fuel use. These are just examples of this. And this is the most obvious application of optimization, because optimization says minimize this function subject to these constraints. This is it. Okay. But it also comes up and is used completely throughout engineering design. So here, X doesn't represent an action. It is an action, just on a different time scale. What it represents is a design, like, for example, of a circuit or device or a mechanical structure, right? So it's actual, often what it means is it's denominated in meters or nanometers, something like that. So it's actually a design of something. And the constraints come from, for example, the manufacturing process and the performance requirements. And here the objective is usually a combination of something like cost, weight, power, these types of things, right? So this is universally used now for a lot of engineering design. By the way, a lot of people don't call it optimization. They'll call it other names. Like, for example, in circuits, you would call it synthesis. Okay? So these are but it's got other names, but this is really what it is usually. Okay. Now, in a third class of applications, very important, X does not represent an action, and it doesn't represent a design. It actually represents parameters in a model. So you have a model of some data. maybe a statistical model, but it doesn't have to be. And then X are the parameters. And the constraints impose requirements on the model parameters, right? So, for example, if they are powers or densities, they have to be non-negative. If X represents a covariance matrix, it's got to be positive semi-definite. And here the objective is a combination of two things. First, the prediction error, the error that your model makes on some data that you have. That's the first thing. And a second term that penalizes model complexity. That's so that your model will work well on new data. Okay? So in this case, X is not an action. It's simply parameters in a model. And this is the universal paradigm for machine learning. I mean, there's many variations on it, but this is pretty much everything. Okay. Inversion. That's another thing you'll hear about. And it's very closely related. Usually, this is a situation like this. X is something you want to estimate or reconstruct, and it's often something physical, like a temperature distribution, a density, or something like that. But you don't have X. What you have is Y, which are measurements which are related to X, and you have a model that relates them. So you're given the measurements, and your job is to guess what X is. And the constraints will come from prior knowledge about X. For example, it's non-negative. And the objective will measure the deviation between the predicted and the actual measurements, and then also there will, in addition, be a regularizer, a second term that says, this is what X, I believe, should look like. Okay? So that's inversion. That's a special case of estimation or model fitting. Finally, one more example, but a very important one in practice. I think it's underused, is in worst case analysis. So, and this was given a very nice name by Stephen Johnson at MIT, which is pessimization. So it's like pessimistic, optimistic, I don't know what. Anyway, it combines them. So, and the idea is this. The variables, the X's now, they are actually parameters or actions that are under the control of an adversary. So this is, so then that's the basic idea here. And the constraints are not physical limits. They are, you are saying what you believe your adversary is capable of. What's the maximum amount? Like you would say, the maximum wind speed, I can't imagine it ever being more than 30 meters per second here, period. Something like that. Then, instead of minimizing, you maximize F0, and the idea is to find the worst possible parameter values. Okay? And the idea is if the worst possible value is okay or tolerable, you're fine. You don't have to worry. By the way, usually it's not fine. It's usually something terrifying. In which case you go back and you change this so it doesn't look so scary. But the idea is this is extremely useful in practice. This allows you to get a good idea of what is the worst possible thing that can happen. Okay? So this is underutilized. In my opinion, it should be used along with what is actually really used, which is Monte Carlo, and some people even call it exhaustive simulation. Of course, it's not exhaustive, right? So these are just good common sense things. This should be used, I think, in many other areas. Finally, I want to mention another application, broad application of optimization. And this is in building models. So many models look like this. The idea is you model something as optimizing some objective. Okay? Now, so for example, and this is even in cases where you know the model is completely wrong. So here's an example. In economics, you would say that an individual is going to make choices that maximize expected utility. Of course, that's not true, right? That's just completely false, right? When someone is deciding what university to go to, they're not maximizing expected utility. They're choosing which university to go to. But the point about a model like that is, even though it's clearly wrong, models like this have had unusually good predictive abilities, right? So other examples are in flux-based analysis in biology. You take a cell, and then you simply say that you solve a linear program to try to figure out what are the reaction rates in a cell. Now that's ridiculous, right? In fact, what a cell does is biology. But in fact, solving these things have very, very good predictive abilities. Now there are some old historical examples of this. For example, if you have a circuit, then the currents in the circuit will distribute in such a way to minimize the total dissipated power. This one, by the way, is not an approximation. It's exact, right, because it's physics. But the point about these are very crude models, and they often work really well, right? So this is just another area where you'd use optimization as a model, an crude model of something's actions. Okay. So the summary is, this comes up absolutely everywhere. So it's in engineering design, it's all of machine learning, all of statistics, it's all of finance, it's all of control. I mean, it just goes on and on. It's all of signal processing. It's all these areas. Now, there's some bad news. The bad news is that you can form optimization problems, but most of them you cannot solve. Now, maybe that doesn't matter. In many cases, that doesn't matter at all. If you're designing a circuit and you can come up with a circuit that has 25% less power and still works, I mean, then that's wonderful. And you're not really worried about whether or not that's the best you can do. If you are, for example, fitting a deep neural network, you are solving an optimization problem. I should say you're attempting to, right? You don't care if you've gotten the best there is or not. What you care about is that you come up with a model that will work well on next week's data. That's what you care about, okay? So in many cases, it doesn't matter that you can't really solve the problem. But there is an exception, and basically it's convex optimization. So these problems are basically tractable, and that means that you can most of the time solve them. It's more than most of the time. It's pretty much all the time. If you formulate a convex optimization problem, it can be solved, or it will be solved if people want to solve it badly enough. So, okay. So now I'll give you a whirlwind tour. It'll be just an overview. If you know about this material, you'll be disappointed. But otherwise, I'll just give you an overview of a whole field. This is a course I teach at Stanford. It's 10 weeks with 3 hours a week, and the students work maybe 15 to 20 hours a week. So I'm compressing that to about 5 minutes. So, it's not lossless compression. So there's going to be some losses here. Okay, so convex optimization problem is just a special case. It looks like this. The objective, there's only actually, in fact, it's very interesting to say what it is. It's a special case of optimization, and it all depends on curvature. It's all curvature. So here's what it is. The equality constraints are linear, and that is zero curvature. That's what it means, okay? And the objective and the inequality constraints have to have positive, or at least non-negative curvature. Non-negative curvature, that's what it means to be convex. It means that this holds, and that means it means nothing more than the function curves up. It means nothing more. So what's weird about it is it's basically, it's all in terms of curvature. It's a bit strange because you might have thought that things like this would be symmetric, right? That negative curvature would be the same as positive curvature. What's weird about it is there's actually an asymmetry, and one of these is easy and the other is very hard, okay? So that's not obvious, I think, but it's true. Okay, so why would you study this? Well, the first thing is, and this is sort of this is a very subjective list. This is my subjective list, and it's in inverse order of how important I think it is. But this is important. Actually, you have a beautiful mathematical theory. It's very nice. There's all sorts of beautiful stuff in it. You get optimality conditions that are necessary and sufficient, and so on. Second, there are effective methods that actually solve these problems. That is in theory, but I think more importantly in practice, right? So in practice, if your problem is convex, we can solve it. Actually, I'm going to say more about that when we get to real-time optimization, because for using something like embedded optimization, where you put optimization in a real-time loop or something like that, it's not simply that you can solve it, it's you have to be able to solve it with total reliability, and that can be done. Okay? So that's actually very important. All right. One nice thing is just intellectually, it pulls all sorts of stuff together, and it's really fun. So when I teach the course, I have people from, I think now 30 departments come to the class, and it's all the ones you could guess, like it's electrical engineering, computer science, mechanical engineering, statistics, economics, but then I start getting people in, well, political science, and history, and medicine. I mean, it's really, I had a law student last year, so finally, I couldn't stand it any longer, and I had to ask him, why are you here? And he said, oh, he said my undergraduate degree was in math. And I'm like, okay, so, but, okay. So this is actually very nice because, you know, for example, at Stanford in the machine learning course, now for the first 6 weeks, people they say, there's a problem, here's another one, and they simply say, that's convex, that's convex, that's convex, and then that's it, and it's very nice. So it means that it's just much more compact, it's a clearer way to think of everything, right? Okay, but here's the main reason. There's tons of applications, so that's the fun part, okay? So, all right, so the applications are areas like, it's completely endemic in areas like machine learning, statistics, finance, supply chain, revenue management, control comes up all over the place, networking, circuit design, areas like flux-based analysis in biology, so a lot of different areas. And it's actually fun. Actually, that's why the class is fun to teach, because I have people from all sorts of different areas. We do a lot of applications, but every time I talk about an application, there are at least 10 people in the audience who know much more about it than I do, which is fun. And then I usually ask them to keep me honest. So I'll find out who they are, and I'll say, if I say anything terribly wrong, please tell me. And by the way, sometimes they do. So it's fine. Okay, so here's how it works at the big picture. The big picture is you have a real practical problem, and you try to make it into a convex optimization problem. Okay, so then the idea is if you succeed, then you can solve it. So that's kind of the idea, and numerically, right? So I should say something about, although there is very interesting theory here, that's not actually my focus or my interest, right? I mean, we have computers, let's use them, right? So I'm not interested in the other, right? Let's use that. Okay, so there's some tricks. The first is you can change variables, and that's actually a fascinating area. So you would be solving a problem, it's not convex, but then you make a change of variables and it becomes convex. And this comes up in control, it comes up throughout statistics. And many times it's actually very interesting. People in practice have discovered these changes of variables using for other reasons. And then you look at it and you realize, my God, the people in the field really knew what they were doing. So very interesting. Now you can approximate stuff. So if you make approximations that are plus minus 5%, you're going to expect it to work, right? If someone says, here's my true fuel use map, right? And it gives you a 300-page booklet describing all the thermodynamics, okay, fine. But if it kind of looks like this, and if it's got a little wrinkle in it that's a little bit, has the wrong curvature, you would still expect it to work. What's actually amazing here is that, and this is actually an amazing thing, it turns out that even when the approximations are absolutely terrible, the history is this. Those methods often work really well. And here's an extreme case, is there are constraints that are not convex, and so here's what you do. You simply ignore them. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? By the way, it's called relaxation, and when people do this, it's usually dressed up to make it sound extremely mathematical and fancy. So you say, I'm going to do a semi-definite relaxation, and so on, or a Lagrangian relaxation. That's fine, but the point is, they're just ignoring it. Okay? So you shouldn't make fun of these things. You should have an open eye about this, because in fact, historically, these things have worked really well, even when the approximations are truly terrible. So I just mentioned that, right? So, okay. So we're going to look at some examples now. That was your 5-minute overview. Okay? Okay. So now we're going to look at some examples. They're going to be quick. So the first one is radiation treatment planning, right? So here you have a patient with a tumor that is too hard for a surgeon to go in and get. It's too close to other stuff. And so what you're going to do is you're going to shoot radiation at the patient, presumably at the tumor. Okay? And you'll have intensities you have to choose, and those are directed at the patient. You take the treatment volume and you divide it up into voxels, and then you'll say that the radiation dose yi is what's received in voxel I. And there's a linear relationship between these. And by the way, this is an entire subfield of medical physics. There's an entire subfield of working out what A is. A could come from geometry. Of course it does. If you aim a beam at a patient and the beam is diverging, you can work out the geometry. But it also includes effects like absorption, attenuation, and scattering. So if it hits bone, it might scatter. Okay, so that's a whole, but for us, it's just y equals ax. Okay, and the goal is to choose x, has to be bigger than or equal to 0. And what you'd like to do is deliver a prescribed radiation dose DI. That's positive for the tumor voxels, and it's 0 for the non-tumor voxels. Now, this is not possible. You cannot do this because, for one thing, you have to go through healthy tissue to get into the tumor. So it's just not possible. Okay, so instead, what we'll do is you'll need to compromise, right? You're going to have to radiate some healthy tissue. And a typical problem might have 1,000 beams, or new things might have 10,000 beams, 100,000, and you might have 1,000,000 voxels or so. Okay, so here it is, posed as a convex optimization problem. What you do is you minimize a function, which is a sum for every voxel of a penalty. And the penalty looks like this. You get charged for going over the prescribed dose, and you get charged for going under the prescribed dose. And these could be different amounts. And that could depend on the voxel as well. And so that's a convex optimization problem. It is not differentiable, right? Because of the plus thing here, you have functions that are 0 and then go up like that. And right at that point, it's not differentiable. Okay? So this is a convex problem, not differentiable, but that doesn't matter. Okay. So here's a quick example. It's from a real case here. So this one had a small number of beams, 360 beams, and about 1/3 of a million voxels. And we actually just solved a problem like this, very simple one. I have a student who worked on this who's an MD, PhD student, so he's both MD and a PhD student. So he worked on this, and we just solved a problem like that and came up with something. This shows you the heat map of, or several slices of course it's 3D, but this is just showing you the slices. And in fact, the people who actually did the case looked at it and said, that's a perfectly good plan, right? So there was one difference though. I think they took something like 6 to 8 hours to do the plan, and this was like actually something like 1.5 seconds on a GPU. So, okay, so I'll move on. So I should say before we move on, this is very much an example from the first class. X is an action, because shooting radiation at a patient, that's for sure an action. So this is from that first class. The next one is going to be from inversion, roughly, or estimation, whichever you want to call it. And it's image in painting. It's a very old problem. It's been around actually for more than maybe 30 years now, something like that. And it goes like this. You have an image, so RGB, an array, a doubly indexed array of red, green, blue. And then what happens is some of them are missing, and you have to guess the values. Okay? And of course, you know what to do. The pixel should look like, it should have the same color as nearby pixels, roughly, right? So in fact, what you do is you're going to choose X to minimize the total variation. This was suggested in the 90s, so this is not new by any means. And what it is this is the space gradient, the spatial gradient of the RGB. So that's a 6 vector. That's 3 RGB. That's RGB. And this is like that's the vertical difference. That's the horizontal difference. And this 6 vector gives you the space gradient of RGB. And this says minimize the sum of the norms. Now, by the way, this is a good example where the classical treatment would go like this. You would put a square right there, and you would square it. And you square it, well, because least squares is traditional. It goes back to Gauss, so that's 200 years ago. It probably goes back longer. But you'd square it, and then you get an analytical solution, and so on and so forth, right? In fact, when you put in the least squares there, you actually get very poor reconstruction. It's not terrible, but you can easily see what was filled in and what was not. Okay, so this is not that. This is no square. And the 2 norm, of course, is a cone. So it's got a point. All right. So I'll just give you a quick example. So here it is. It's about 1 million variables here. Here's the original. Then we simply removed, I don't know, maybe 5% of the pixels here. Okay? And then we simply solve that optimization problem, and this is what you get. Okay? So I think from where you're sitting, you can't see any difference at all. Or you might ask, when we guessed what the entries were, are we right? And the answer to that is no. When we filled in entries here, they are not correct. What you can say is we filled in entries that are when a human looks at it, they're plausible and they look similar. So that's actually what happened here, right? So this is not correct. So this is what it looked like. By the way, you could do way better than this nowadays, okay? Using, well, for example, deep neural nets, but many, many other ways, even variations on this would make this quite good. So the point here is not that you can do this, it's something so simple gives you something this good. It's kind of shocking. Okay. Next one is for machine learning, is support vector machine. So the goal is you want to predict a Boolean outcome, like, for example, fraud or not fraud for a financial transaction. And you are given data. Data is a set of pairs. You get a feature vector here. For example, it could be features extracted from a proposed transaction. It could be the card holder, the location, the time, the product, the cost, a bunch of other stuff. It could be attributes of the history of that card holder. It could be all sorts of other stuff, right? So that's A. And then B is an outcome, -1 for not fraud, +1 for fraud. So one presumes that most of these are -1, the data, but a few are +1. Okay. And what you're going to do is you're going to make a linear predictor. So that means you're going to choose the vector W and this offset V. And then simply the sign of this affine function is going to be your prediction, right? So that's the idea. Many ways to choose W and V, but one that is used very widely is called support vector machine. And it looks like this. It says that you should choose W and V to minimize this convex function. And it's a complicated function that's got a plus, that's a plus, so it's non-differentiable. It's one of these things that's 0, and then it goes up. And here, lambda is a positive parameter. Okay, so that's what it says. This is how to do it. This has been used for maybe 20 years now. It's used absolutely everywhere, and variations on this. Okay, so here's an example of what it might look like. This is a bit silly because you would never use you don't need a support vector machine to do classification in 2 dimensions. In 2 dimensions, you just scatter plot the two things, and you take out a pencil and you draw a shape, and you say that's the classifier, right? But the point is the same method is going to work for 2,000 dimensions, 20,000, or 2 million, right? Or I think at one point, I don't know, about 5 years ago, I guess Google's spam detector was using up to about 1 billion parameters, okay? So, and obviously you can't do that with your eyeball. So, okay. So let me talk about one more thing. Which is related to that, is the idea of L1 regularization. So here the idea is if you add a multiple of the sum of the absolute values of the variables to the objective and minimize, then this tends to result in x being sparse. And that means that a bunch of the x's are actually 0. So that's the idea. Okay? And there is a bunch of theory about that. I'm not going to say anything about it, but there is some. And to me, it's fascinating that there even is that such theory even exists. It does for a few cases, but it's used in many more cases where there is no theory. Now, one nice thing about it is it preserves convexity, and so it's tractable. And this is used for lots and lots of things. For example, sparse design. So for example, if you're going to design an antenna array and you want to have a beamforming thing, what people would do now is they would pretend you're going to have an array of 1,000 different antennas. You have no intention of building an array with 1,000 antenna elements. Okay? So instead, what you do is those 1,000 are interpreted as merely potential antenna elements. Whenever the weight on an antenna is 0, that means you didn't need it. So the point is if it's sparse, there's a lot that are missing. Okay, and that's great. It has completely changed all of statistics, all of it. So in the past 30 years, this is probably one of the biggest advents in statistics. I mean, along with a move towards more algorithmic methods, of which this is one. It has completely inverted all of statistics. I'll say why in a minute. And it's used for a lot of other stuff. Okay, so here's an example. I like the example. It's Lasso. I don't know if you've heard about it, but it's something like least absolute shrinkage and selection operator. I think that's what it stands for. So, okay. And it looks like this. It's an ordinary least squares problem. So that goes back to Gauss. So that's 1805. Roughly. It's actually quite likely that people knew about least squares before Gauss. Okay? But it's least squares. That's pretty much the oldest convex optimization problem. And you add L1 regularization. Okay? And what's kind of cool about this is that this thing is actually useful even when A is wide. Now, when A is wide, that's a really strange situation because what it says is you're fitting a model, and someone says, how many parameters do you have? And you might say, well, I have 1,000 parameters. And they would say, okay, how many measurements do you have? And you'd say, well, I have 100. And it's just completely wrong. You'd say to them, oh, I'm sorry, didn't you mean to switch them around? And they'd say, no, that's what I really meant, right? So it's a terribly overfit model, right? And this is widely used in areas like that. Okay, so by the way, the classical analog is so-called ridge regression, where you square a 2-norm here. This has an analytical solution, right? So, okay, so I'll give you a quick example. And we'll get to this later, but I'll give you a quick example of this. So here's an example with 1,000 parameters to estimate. Here's the true x. And you have 200 examples. So I give you 200 noisy measurements of 1,000 things, and I say, what are the 1,000 things? That's a ridiculous problem. Nobody can solve that. It doesn't make any sense. But you're also given the hint that the x you're looking for is sparse. If you do an L2 reconstruction, you get absolutely nothing here, right? If you do the lasso reconstruction, it's basically perfect. Okay? So, I mean, actually, these are stunning things if you haven't seen them before. And even if you've seen them before, you should stop and take a moment to reflect on how crazy this is, right? So, more and more of my students now have taken courses in statistics, and so they're used to this. And so when I would show things like this in the class, they go, oh yeah, sure. What else was going to happen? And I'd say, this is crazy. Anyway, so then we stop to have a moment of reflection of how cool this actually is. Right, so, okay. All right. Now I'll say a little bit about how you solve these problems. Well, if you've got thousands and tens of thousands of variables, I mean, it depends, and constraints, I can solve this on my laptop very easily, okay? I mean, if there's enough sparsity there, it's relatively easy to do. And it doesn't work all the time, but it works like, 99.9% of the time. And if you're ever in a situation, which I'll describe later, when it needs to work all of the time, that can be arranged, okay? So it's not quite a technology, but it's getting there. And bits and pieces of it are already there. Okay. Very important is this, is the advent of modeling languages, right? So this is high-level language support, and the idea is you're going to describe the problem in a high-level language. That high-level description is parsed into a standard form called a cone program, and then that's solved by some standard solver and then transformed back, okay? So, by the way, this is extremely important because this is the key to how this is used. And that's the whole point about optimization. The whole point about optimization is that instead of trying to figure out how to solve your practical problem, you shouldn't do that. What you should do is try to articulate what you want and let the solver make the decisions. That's actually the right way to, that's what, so I mean, at an abstract point of view, that's actually what using optimization is about, right? So everybody knows if you're flying an airplane and it's rolling to the left, you should tip up your right aileron. Everybody knows that, right? But the correct way to do this, modern way, is actually, that takes into account absolutely everything, is to not hard code that decision logic, but instead to have an objective that says it's not good to not be flying level, right? And then in fact the optimization will do just what you thought it would do, but it will work in cases where you couldn't have hard coded it. Okay. Now what this does is it allows rapid prototyping for small and medium problems. And it changes teaching completely, because I taught this course before the advent of these and after. Before, it was, largely, I mean, it was a kind of a math class. I mean, we would kind of talk about the theory of it. We would talk about applications, but the student wouldn't really do very many. After these, now, the students you do it all. You don't get out of that class, but when you get out of that class, you have done portfolio optimization, signal processing, image processing, network, resource allocation, control. You've done finance, everything. And it's just a few lines of code, right? So, okay. Cvx is one of these. It is not the first one. The first one was something called YALMIP. That's from, I guess, maybe a long time ago now, maybe 10 years, maybe more even. And so, for example, this is what, to solve this problem, you would write it out this way. And if you know MATLAB, then I think this is all pretty self-explanatory. But the idea is it's very much along this idea that you articulate what you want, not how to get it. At the end here, this is compiled, and it'll come back and it'll find optimal values for A and W and V. Okay, so that's the idea. A more recent and much more modern variation on this is Cvx Pi. That's now a couple of years old. That's in Python. And it would look like this. And if you program in Python, and I should add a little note here. You should, okay? Because if you just do MATLAB, that's not good. So Python is a real language. So please learn Python. Actually, it's terrible. This is Python like 2.7 or something. And the newest one has got some horrible expression for like matrix that I can't even stand. But nevertheless, it's a standard, so you have to learn it. Okay, fine. So this is very Pythonic, right? It says you form a variable as an object. You construct a variable. You construct an expression. This says you construct an objective. And then you construct a problem here, and then you call the solve method on it. So it's very nice. Actually, if you're going to learn something beyond MATLAB, sorry, since I got off on this, make it Julia. That's something you should do. So just trust me on that one. Actually, so if you go to a lot of places and you say you program in MATLAB, I mean, unless it's something where everybody else does that, of which there are fewer and fewer companies, you'll actually be ridiculed. They won't, maybe, sometimes they'll laugh in your face. I do know places like that. But mostly they won't, which is worse. They'll just say, oh, that's so interesting. Oh, look at that, the interview's over. And you'd say, oh, but I had the whole afternoon. You go, no, that's fine, that's enough, thank you. And you just leave. So anyway, so Julia, however, if you drop that will increase your social status. So for many, many reasons, you should actually install Julia, actually right now if you have your laptop or whatever, but tonight for sure. Okay, fine. Let's move on. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about now is a couple of more relatively recent research. The first one is on real-time embedded optimization. Okay, so the idea is that you have applications where you repeatedly solve the same problem over and over again, but with different data. So for example, in control, you're always solving the same problem, but what changes is your current state, possibly the objectives and everything else, the terminal constraint, the target that you want to track. Some of that has changed. In finance, you solve the same problem. This is how all of quantitative finance works, all of it. You solve the same problem, again, but you have updates on predictions of returns, variances, risk, and transaction costs. Those update from, depends how often you're trading, but if it's could be every minute or something like that, you get updated things and you solve the same problem over and over again. Now, of course, what this requires is if it's for control or something like that, you have to have total reliability, right? So if you're going to control a jet engine and you have to come up with a decision every 10 milliseconds, you have to come up with a decision on how to open and close various valves, things like that. The point is you cannot fail. I mean, obviously you can't fail. And you also have to have hard real-time execution. So you have to know that it will never take more than 4.6 milliseconds to execute. You can't stop for garbage collection or something like that, right? You can't allocate memory. I mean, this is ridiculous. Okay. Now, the idea of embedded optimization is extremely old. It goes back as far as optimization itself. So already in the 60s and 70s and 80s, people were using optimization to run supply chains, and they would solve them maybe once a day. Chemical process control has used this for 25 years, where you actually solve a large optimization problem because they only have to make a decision every 15 minutes or every hour because they're very slow. Now, same for trading. Since maybe the 90s, algorithmic trading has worked this way. You solve an optimization problem to determine what trades to make. That's been happening since the 90s. Now, for a lot of these things, it's not clear that that these things will speed up. What's very cool is that you can actually carry out these optimization problems in milliseconds or microseconds, which is actually stunning. And this is just very simple. This changes everything, right? Because, well, okay, you're safe if you're in a very few fields. If you're doing sort of high-speed signal processing for communications, where you're solving something at multiple gigasamples per second, you're pretty safe from optimization. We can't solve an optimization yet in a nanosecond, right? but we can solve them in 50 microseconds. We can solve them in a millisecond, right? And so for a lot of control, you should just be using optimization, and I'll just say what my opinion is. My opinion is this is the correct way to do control, period. I can't imagine doing it any other way. Okay, so this is how I would do it. It seems to me like this is kind of like the PID control of the 21st century, right? It's basic, it kind of works, you should use it, right? That's the idea. So, okay, so I'll give you a quick example. So here's something I'm going to push. I'm going to take an object, I'm going to move it, and then from still to still, and I'm going to move it like a unit, 1 unit of distance, right? I'm going to push it so hard that I have to model it as, I have to model a couple of vibration modes. So I'll have a couple of vibration modes. This force is constrained. And there'd be a lot of theory on finding the minimum theory. You could look at classical optimal control. You could go get a book by Pontryagin or something like that and read about Pontryagin maximum principle. And you could sit down and write a whole bunch of equations and page after page of equations. And you might even be able to solve this one exactly. I'm not entirely sure. You can certainly solve it exactly, maybe for 2. But I don't know about for 3. You probably can. That's not the point. The modern thing is you just look at this and say it's a convex problem. Done. That's it. Okay? So that's the modern. And the nice thing about that is it'll actually work when instead of 1 input, you've got 50, and the dynamics is very complicated and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So here's a quick example of how that works. You wanted to have the minimum time to move this to its new position. And here it is, and it's 6 time units, whatever that is, I don't know. And then that's the optimal input you should apply, okay? So it's not obvious what it's doing, although after the fact you can explain what it's doing, right? So this is pushing it it's pushing it, of course. These things down here is breaking it. And this oscillation you can think of as a way to do active damping of the vibration modes that you've excited. That's how you'd say it in mechanical engineering, okay? So that's the idea. But the point is, the modern method is you just say this is it. There's no, you just put in the problem list, you write code, it's 3 lines, 5 lines, and you get that. Okay. Now I'll say a little bit about Cvx Gen. So this was a PhD student of mine, Jacob Mattingly, put together what was supposed to be, I'll get to that, but you'll know why in a minute. It was supposed to be just a prototype to show that you could actually make a code generator. And what a code generator does is, what you do is you write a high-level family description, just like CVX. Except what happens now is instead of this solving the problem, what it emits is flat C source, which you then compile, and now you have a customized solver for that particular problem. Okay? So that's the idea. Now you knew you were going to get a speed up, and you would guess 10x. I mean, at the very least, you're not parsing the problem each time, right? But the point is, the typical speed up actually ranges between 10 and 1,000. It can be as high as 10,000x. Okay? So actually, it turns out it's not just the speed that's important. What's very important is actually that the software footprint is very small. It's not a giant thing. It doesn't have libraries and stuff like that. There's no dynamically loaded libraries. You just generate flat C. And in fact, it's almost branch free, which means that when you turn on optimization in the compiler, it will do all sorts of optimizations and actually make it a lot faster. Okay. So, and I should say, this started off as something that was supposed to be for a prototype. And I think this is not bad for a prototype, because then it turned out that this is exactly what was used. How many people saw the landing of the first stage in the Falcon 9 or whatever? So, the rest of you saw it. You're just not saying so, right? Please? Okay. Then could I add, you now have 2, I'm going to assign a second homework problem. Your first homework problem was to install Julia. Remember that? You now have a second one. Go to Google and Naver and type in SpaceX first stage landing. Actually, you shouldn't have to type that much in. If you go to video and type in SpaceX, it's going to, actually, you should go find all the ones that failed. Those are good too, by the way. So those, okay. All right. So actually, that was just Cvx Gen. So it was a student of mine who went to SpaceX, and that's what he did. And actually, it was kind of horrifying. So SpaceX culturally is supposed to be like a Silicon Valley culture for space, right? So ordinary space stuff is extremely conservative, right? Like at NASA, if you make a control law for it, It's people test it like crazy. Then it goes to a completely separate company whose job it is to show that it doesn't work. And then maybe 10 years later, it actually flies. Everybody, that's basically how NASA works, right? So SpaceX was this. I went into the grad student office, and I started talking to the student. He said, "Oh, hang on, I have to just finish. I have to commit some code." And I said, what do you mean, I have to commit some code? I said, "Is it for a flight coming up?" And he goes, yeah, it's going to run on a flight. And I said, "Well, when's the flight?" And he said, "In 10 days. And I said, "Are you kidding? Are you serious? You commit the code and it's gonna fly on this 10-story rocket in 10 days?" And he said, "Yes." So, and by the way, that's what they did. They'd send them up, they would explode. You'll see when you look at the history. They'd explode, and then they go, "Oh, too bad, what happened?" And they'd find out what happened, and they'd fix it next time, and they'd send another one, it would explode. Anyway, after about 10 or 15 explosions, which were kind of cool, they started working, and they worked every time since then. So actually, I did ask him, "Really? You can just if you type git push, that goes into the production branch?" And he goes, "No, he sends a pull request," and he said 2 people have to check his code first. He said, "But one guy has never looked at anything, and the other trusts me." So basically, I said, "So if you make a typo right now, it's going to be bad." And he said, "No, we have a lot of tests, but yeah, that's right." So anyway, okay, fine. So we'll move on. All right. So that looks something like this. I mean, once you've seen these languages, this would look very familiar, and you'd look something like this. And then this would be compiled into flat C. Okay, and the point is you get things that are fast. These are pretty much out of date, but the point is you start getting things measured in microseconds, right? So, and these are being used more and more. It's coming to robotics pretty soon, or maybe it's already there, and it's going to be going to other things too, right? So basically a lot of things where the main takeaway point is this, is that we can actually, you think of optimization as big and complicated and expensive and fancy and stuff like that, used by, giant companies or banks or the military. Anyway, that picture is completely wrong, because you can solve very sophisticated optimization problems on your phone and almost in real time. And not many people have figured that out, okay? So, all right, last topic is going to be large-scale distributed optimization. This is the opposite. We're actually now going to go to extremely large problems, which you cannot possibly solve on a phone, but that's the idea. And this comes up all over the place, right? It comes up in the era of so-called big data. That's a little bit of a fraud, the big data thing. So most of the times when people talk about big data, it's really not. And also, by the way, my colleagues who do things like multimedia say, "Hey, we've been processing data that's really big at high rates, but we never called it big data." Anyway, so whatever. But it comes up in all sorts of stuff. Areas like just dynamic optimization on large-scale networks, right? So if you're going to do energy management, for example, let's take the state of California. If you're going to schedule, let's say, the 3,100 generators in California with the power flow across maybe 6,000 transmission lines and maybe about 7,000 load points, and you're going to do that for 15-minute intervals for a day, all of a sudden, that's actually not a small problem anymore. That's big. By the way, it's not solved. The way they do it is the way they do it everywhere in the world, and it's some kind of heuristic. They do one thing, then they do another, then they come back and check this, and so on and so forth. So, and then they make adjustments in real time. But, okay. So we'll use distributed optimization, and the idea is you split the problem up into pieces, and you're going to assign the pieces to different either agents or processors or devices or threads or whatever you want. And they're going to coordinate to solve a large problem they're all going to solve their little bit in parallel, and then they're going to exchange messages and do it again. And that's the idea. So now this goes way back. This goes back into the 1950s. So this is actually mentioned in George Danzig's first book on the first book on linear programming mentions this. So this is not new by any means, right? Oh, and I guess in the 50s and 60s, people said that using these techniques, it might be possible, just possibly, to solve an optimization problem with up to 1,000 variables. So that's a joke. I can do that on my phone, okay? Now, but that's not fair, right? So, okay. So the way, one way, we'll look at a very basic distributed optimization problem. It's called consensus optimization. It's actually the simplest one there is, but also if you can solve this, you can solve anything. So it's kind of it's generic in that sense. So all you want to do is you want to minimize a function, which is a sum of functions, and you want to handle each of these functions fi separately. That's the idea here, is you want to have a separate one, a separate agent or processor or whatever you want, core or thread for each one of these. And for example, if this were machine learning, this would be, fi would be the loss function on the ith block of training data. And so the idea there is that if we have a bunch of entities, each sitting on a petabyte of data, let's say, then each of them can fit a model or evaluate a model. And then what we'd really like to do is collect all the data together like this and then minimize, that would fit the model. What this says is we're going to be able to do it without moving the data. So that's what this does, right? So, okay, so we put this in consensus form, which means that we're going to let each agent have its own opinion of X, and then we're going to add a constraint that they all have to agree. This is called the consensus constraint. Okay. Now, here you go back to the 70s, 80s. You go back to an algorithm from the 80s, which in fact was actually an algorithm, it's closely related to an algorithm from the 50s for solving PDEs. It's called ADMM, and it's got lots of other names. It's related, it's operator splitting, it's Douglas Rackford, it's all sorts of different things. It's got a very long history, so it's also not new by any means. And it says that what you should do is this. Each agent entirely independently should minimize its own function, well, of course, plus, and then this term here is the term that's going to coordinate everything together, okay? And actually, it's completely interpretable. This says X bar is the average in the last of all the opinions in the last round. So this says don't move very far from the last round's opinion. And there's this mysterious variable UI. And then you look at what UI is. UI is this. This is the error. That's the difference between your opinion and the average of everyone else's opinions. That's the error. And this equation says that UI is the running sum of the errors. So this is actually just PI control. That's what this is. It's integral control. It's nothing else. Okay? There is a big difference. This algorithm here always works. In other words, doesn't matter if these functions take on the value plus infinity, they can be non-differentiable, all sorts of other stuff. This always works, period. So that's ADMM. Okay. So I'll give you a quick example just to see what it looks like. It's a silly example because I'm going to do support vector machine with 2 variables. Again, that's silly. And I'm going to do it with 400 examples. That I could solve in about 60 microseconds. Okay, on an ARM core or something. So that's not a complicated problem, right? This is just to illustrate. But I'm going to do something very evil. So in this problem, I have Boolean outcomes that are either plus or minus 1. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort the examples, and to each entity, I'm going to give everybody either all positive or all negative. So each one of them has an extremely skewed view of the world. Okay, so that's the idea. They're going to have to do consensus to work. And here's what you get. So here's the original data. And these are the original, these are on the first round, what everybody's guess is. They're absolutely terrible, but of course, because I gave evil data, that's the average on the first round. This is after 5 steps of ADMM, and that's after 40. Okay? So this is the idea. And I mean, it's not impressive given the size of the problem, but the point is to think about what's actually just happened here. What happened is there were 20 groups, each of which had some data. And they knew absolutely nothing. They did not know how many other groups there were. They did not know how much data the other groups had. Nothing. Each one simply calculated its thing, sent its opinion to this to the master that coordinated everything, and then updated and solved it again. Right. So, and I should say this is actually in production. I think at Google and Facebook or something like that in certain areas. This is what they do. They do consensus. Actually, what was very funny was I was with, so people who focus more on the theory, they don't like these methods because this has the slowest convergence rate there is, right? So, somebody I was with some other couple of people who actually use this in industry applications, and some people who are more theoretically oriented. The theoretically oriented one says, well, how many iterations do you do? What stopping criterion do we use? And he said, oh yeah, we just run it 5 steps. And the theoretician almost like fell, he goes, has it converged? And he goes, yeah, it works fine. So anyway, so it's funny. All right, I'll skip that. I'll go to the summary. So the summary is, these problems come up in a lot of applications. And you can solve them very effectively. If it's a small or medium scale problem and there's no real-time thing, then I or a student or anybody, or I guess the way we like to say it at Stanford is this: even a professor can do this. So that's how easy it is, right? So even, I mean, they can't do it that well, but they can do it. The point is, right? And you know, if it's a medium scale problem, general purpose methods, I think they're really cool ideas about applying these at the millisecond level. I mean, I think this is fascinating because a lot of things just people haven't thought through. I mean, it's a new idea that you can solve a sophisticated optimization problem 1,000 times a second. That's kind of a new thing. And so people just aren't even ready for this idea. Like, what do you do with it? So, okay. And the same for the arbitrary scale problems. It's the same thing. And the high-level language support makes prototyping easy. I mean, that's actually very important about this. So, okay. So there are a lot of references. I mean, you don't need any of this because you just go to Google or something and you'll find everything. But I do want to make one very important point, especially because like these are all from my group. So the main point I want to make is this. What I've reported on is actually the work of hundreds and hundreds of people across many decades, and it is not the work of my group. So many, many people worked on all these things and things like this. We did some of these. So whatever you do, if you ask a question, don't say, how do your methods do this? Because they're not my methods, and they're, you know, many people have worked on these things. So, okay, so I'm gonna quit here, and I'll be very happy to answer questions about actually anything. So.
All right, so is there any questions or comments? Yes, Professor Chung-Chu Chung from Hanyang University.
Okay, thank you for your excellent whole survey of the optimization. I attended several times of your lecture and was always I'm motivated by your work. First, I'd like to ask your opinion. You mentioned about Julia. And as far as I know, Julia accommodated the parallel processing. So there is efficiency for like if we learn the capability of parallel processing compared to MATLAB code, because MATLAB originally made by based on the LINPACK LISPACK and LAPACK, linear algebra pack. So MATLAB doesn't use the parallel processing originally. So they recently provide some tool for machine learning. So they made a link for we can use a CUDA compiler. So they said they have an ability to use parallel processing. So although that provide, I don't know whether that is how much efficiency compared to Julia. So first, I'd like to ask you the opinion. And you mentioned that Cvx Gen, that is that give some code generator for embedded system. So nowadays for embedded system, we need to use parallel processing for like NVIDIA, GPU. So I'm not sure whether your Cvx Gen can accommodate the CUDA language.
Okay, good. So those were two good questions. I hope I'll remember them. I mean, so the first was about MATLAB versus Julia, right? So that's a pretty simple thing. I mean, it's an unfair comparison because Julia is a few years old. So it turns out when you create a language 25 years after another one, you can pick and choose, and not to mention you have Moore's law. So processors are now 10 to the 4 times more powerful, right? So yes, Julia is, I mean, for targeting all sorts of things like multi-core stuff, it works beautifully. It's beautifully. I mean, again, I don't know anything about it, but it's all JIT, so it's just in time compiled and all that kind of stuff. That works very well. And I think that's the right way to go, as opposed to something that is both expensive, closed, and doesn't work as well. So there's your choice. Your choice is you can buy something that's expensive, doesn't work very well, or you can get something that's completely free and works much better. So your choice. right? So that would be that. On the, then you asked about CVX Gen, and and GPUs and things like that. So I should say something very careful. So I didn't say it, and I'm glad you brought that up. CVX Gen generates flat C, and so it runs single-threaded. Now, as far as I know, you're not going to use multi-threaded things in real-time control, right? Because you can't have a kernel stop a thread and do. I mean, you can have a couple of things that are. Yeah, I mean, you can, but so these are all single. So all the times I was mentioning there, those are all single-thread. Yeah, yeah. So.
Long time ago, I studied a lot with your PhD dissertation concerning Volterra series.
Yeah. That was a long time ago.
Yeah, long time ago. And it was quite theoretical, and now by comparison, you are working a lot more practical areas, right? And my question is, which area should be emphasized more in our education in, for example, electrical engineering, theory or practice? And the second question, in which area you are more happier in practical things or theoretical things?
Okay, they're related questions. It's a superb question, in fact, and I'm glad you asked it. So, what I'm actually really interested in, I mean, my original training is in pure mathematics, but I also did super practical electrical engineering at first, right? So, now is an unbelievable time where these are not separated, right? That a lot of the theory can actually be used immediately and deliver value immediately. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there are very sophisticated languages now, like Julia, Python. MATLAB is not one of them, but it was a step there, and historically in 1984, it was a big step there. So high-level languages will actually, you can articulate an algorithm. They'll actually execute them. The hardware, due to my colleagues, and of course, people at places like Samsung, right, have made things unbelievably fast. So there's never been a time when the gap between the theory and the practice was so small, right? So right now, if you work out some better method to do machine learning or something like that, I mean, you can implement it like tomorrow. So it's an amazing time, and I think what that means is that this old axis that used to be like, here's applications and here's theory, is all wrong. I don't even know what it looks like, but I like to think of the class I teach on this is that the actual topology looks like this, right? And they come back together. So I've had people ask me things like, well, your class, my understanding is it's very theoretical. I heard it's the most theoretical class in the EE department. And I said, oh, that's true. And then they said, I also heard it's the most practical class in the EE department. And I said, yeah, that's true. Yeah. So you see, I think that's it's a very exciting time, right? And of course, not just about this, but a lot of other areas in machine learning, in communications information, all these areas. It's very exciting times, and I think we have to rethink entirely what it means, the theory versus practice. You still need the theory. You may not need exactly the theory that's being taught. I think a lot of the classical theory that's being taught, we don't need anymore. What we really need is like super clear thinking, because that has enormous practical value, unbelievable practical. But it's a beautiful time, because right now, a lot of the theory is fully actionable, meaning you can actually do stuff with it. So it's a great question, and I think it's a very exciting time right now. And yes, we have to rethink our curriculum and how it all goes together. But I like the idea that it should be both. I love the idea that it's a class that's both very mathematical and extremely practical. It's great. It's fun.
And so I'm always impressed in your genius and the deep insight in developing lots of tricks in formulation of the convex optimizations. And I'm interested in developing the learning mechanisms of the deep learning.
Oh, okay.
And so recently, there is a big advances in the deep learning areas. And so now learning mechanisms is still non-convex optimization problems.
Sure.
Still, we have to apply the stochastic gradient descent.
Yep.
But recently, the neuron activation neurons is piecewise linear activation neurons instead of the sigmoid neurons.
Right.
And so I'd like to find some way to apply the convex formulations from the nonlinear deep learning techniques. And so I'd like to ask you, is there any novel ideas to transforming the nonlinear deep learning mechanisms into the convex optimization problems?
So
I'd like to
your opinion. It's a great question. I'm glad somebody asked it because it should come up. What about deep learning? Right. So, so actually, people ask me that all the time, and the answer is I actually don't know if there is. I have heard every couple of years somebody says, "Oh, I have a formulation that's either convex or biconvex or something," and it sounds interesting. But so far, I don't think anyone has done anything that worked better than stochastic gradient descent. So what I should say about deep learning is actually I think that the methods people are using there, these are very sophisticated optimization methods, right? And the key is they have to run on either GPUs or TPUs, right, or something like this. Things like TensorFlow, these are amazing, these are just amazing developments of software. And the algorithms also are not as simple as just saying it's SGD, right? There's all sorts of stuff in there with the regularization and how do you do it asynchronously and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot going on, and I'm actually very impressed with how people are doing that optimization. That actually brings me to make a comment that I did want to make at one point. And especially this is important for maybe the younger people here. So one, and it's actually something where I think the people who have worked on deep learning have done a superb job of. And that's this, making extremely high quality open source software available. That is important for many, many reasons. If you believe that all the stuff that we work on is actionable, I mean like really actionable, then it seems to, I mean it's great. You can make open source software, and if you do it well and if you document it and then make it available like on GitHub, people will use it. And I think that the people who have been doing machine learning statistics, they have this beautiful culture of having everything open. You don't write a paper without having some R code that does it. Or you don't just talk about neural networks, you actually make extremely high quality software available to the entire world. And I think that's great. And I think in a lot of areas people don't do that enough. That's my opinion. Control is one, so that's the field I'm in. We don't do it enough. And I think actually that's very important.
Thank you. By the way, Professor Jin-Young Choi from our department, he is teaching convex optimization. So.
Oh, okay, great. Good.
Yes, I am teaching convex optimization with your books written.
Okay, good.
As every year, 100 students or 130 students applied these courses.
Wow.
That's
great.
Owing to your textbook, outstanding textbooks.
Okay, great. Great. Are you having them? Do you use Cvx Pi yet? Or
yes.
No,
not yet.
CVX.
Yeah.
Okay.
Currently, we have to use the CVX.
Okay.
The Cvx Pi is open.
Everything's just open. Everything's
open. Yes.
Yep. Yeah, it's Python.
Thank you. I'd like to try to use that.
Ah, okay. You could even,
Cvx
there's
Pi.
even one, there's something for Julia. It's called convex.jl.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Thank
Great.
you.
Right, so first homework for ours is that install Julia tonight. That's what we need to
That was
do.
your first homework problem.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Any others? Yes. No. So please go ahead.
Yes.
Thanks for today's presentation. I want to have some insight of deep learning. In deep learning, we mainly use convex optimizer like stochastic gradient descent or cogenitive method. Even we mainly deal with non-convex problems. And actually, it works really well, but I don't know the reason. So
Right.
could you give me some insight?
Yeah, so actually, I think no one knows the real reason. So, and that's okay. Maybe someone will, at some point, know the reason why these things work very well. So I think, but it's a strange thing. There are times when things work better than any theory justifies. A good example is linear programming, a simplex method from the late 40s. George Danzig came up with this, And it's just a method for solving linear, and it works unbelievably well. Here's another example, interior point methods. These are both from convex optimization. The theory says, you know, it's polynomial time, blah, blah, blah. So what? The practice is they work way better, that the number of iterations is typically like 25, period. Just 25, that's it. No one really knows why in both cases. I mean, people have some ideas about the insight, about why, you know, why it works, but basically they don't. So at some point, I think you just have to accept it and say, this is great, we're very lucky. Maybe someday someone will figure it out. And I think the same may be true of some of the deep learning stuff. That there it's not a question of working, because, well, working means, do you create a model that works well on untested data? And the fact that they work well, unusually well, I think right now no one really understands, but it appears to be an empirical fact. So,
Thanks for a clear answer.
yeah.
Okay, so we still have 15 minutes for discussion. So it is one of our traditions that you not only ask questions, you can share your thoughts. Maybe you can share your experience about some success story or optimization or failure story, whatever. So anything is just discussed in this time. So yeah, please think about, raise your hand and ask anything. So any other one? Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, I have one question. You have mentioned about the quantum mechanics in the earlier your lecture, and so are you talking about the quantum computing, or is
Yes.
there any
Yes. So
can you briefly summarize the current research about the quantum mechanics and convex optimization?
So no, because I don't know anything about it, but I do know people who do know about it. So I can tell you a little bit about it.
Right,
But
thank you.
Don't trust me because, okay. So yeah, so it's used in, for example, quantum information and things like this, where the things you're messing with are actually like unitary matrices. And then there are many problems you want to solve where they just look at a so-called semi-definite relaxation, and people have been using these things very successfully for that. Don't ask me anymore because I don't know anything about it. But I know people who do. Yeah. So, by the way, this is if you go to Google and type in, quantum. If you type in quantum mechanics, convex optimization, you'll find plenty of stuff. It'll actually be quantum mechanics semi-definite programming, and I'm sure it's very interesting. But I don't know anything about it.
Thank you. And any else? Well, actually, yeah, Professor Kwon.
My question is very easy. I know you have a very good software. Have you ever tried to commercialize to make MATLAB-like software? This is the first question. I may understand your idea, but since we have very good software, I'm very interested in entrepreneurship, right?
Yeah.
Second question, what are the research topic left for serious students, particularly for theoretical part?
Okay.
This is the second question.
Okay. Well, those are good questions, but better than the question about quantum mechanics, which I know nothing about. Okay. So the first was about commercialization. So I have been involved in a couple of times in attempts and even sort of successful attempts at commercializing. This is just very subjective, but my experience is I have a lot more fun when it's open, because then a lot of people use these things. If they're well designed, a lot of people use them, and it's more fun. Also, when you go give a talk, you're not doing commercial sales. So if I say you should use CVX, you don't have to get out your bank card to pay for it or something. I mean, this is just completely subjective. That I have enjoyed more doing ones that were open source. So I also think that's the future of a lot of stuff, because it's the future of sort of like open science, and I think good engineering is actually open. I think so even things that are being used by companies, there's actually companies that are radical now, and all of their software development is completely open on GitHub. Just you can see what each engineer checked in that day. It's completely radical. It's bizarre and radical, and I think it's very cool. So then the second question is, what's left over for a theory student? So actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to answer a question that's related to that. So in fact, what I'm going to do is just make a recommendation to a theory student, because I was once a theory student. I was in pure math, right? And so my recommendation would be this. I have actually my first student now who's in pure math. So, but this is a wonderful time to be trained in pure math, because basically in math you're being trained on abstraction, right? But in fact, all of these modern languages are just, they will actually support abstraction at amazing levels. So you can actually start writing code that looks like the pure math. I mean, where the ideas are really completely correct. And actually, that's not just an aesthetic thing, although it is, because it is beautiful and cool, but what's really cool about it is actually that's better code. So what I would say to a student interested in the math, please keep studying math, that's fine. Please try to improve complexities of convergence of whatever algorithms, please go ahead. But in fact, I'd give a plea to that student, please learn a lot of computer science. And please go and hang out and watch people doing machine learning and control and signal and these things to see and vision. So they actually see that all the math is actually being done right now. So that's what I would tell a student who wants to do math. I would not discourage them from doing math. Quite the opposite. We need more people, but not people who hide in the little area where they just do pure math. They should get out in the real world, because people are really using math now, and I think it's great. So I think you had a question, right?
Okay, Professor In-Sun Yang.
I have two things.
Okay.
So first,
everybody has two questions.
So could you tell us your personal story about how and why you started diving into this field of convex optimization? And also, do you have any general advice to students who just started doing research in convex optimization? I mean, based on your experiences.
Sure. So I would like to say that I thought it through and it was organized. No, it was totally disorganized and random. So I did pure math, and then I switched over to electrical engineering, which was, that kind of made sense. So I did that, and then I used optimization for a couple of things, and I thought, wow, this is great. This is kind of cool. And then I kind of used it for more things in control. And then I thought, wow, a lot of these things in control you can solve with convex optimization. And then after about, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, I thought, this is silly, because I can think of a lot of things in a lot of other fields that are also convex optimization. So it was all accidental. It was not planned out. It was not, I mean, I could lie and say that I carefully planned it out and I had a vision. No, I just, every day I'd hear about, somebody would say, hey, did you know about this? And I'd go like, no, that's really cool. That's great. So I did it, it's just completely random. Like, I'm kind of like a child. I would play with something, and I would see something shiny over there, and then I would go and work on it. I mean, so that's my evolution. But I still do that. So yeah, there's things I'm supposed to do, but if someone comes up to me and says, hey, you want to see something really cool, and it's about something I've never heard about, I'm like, yeah, of course I want to hear about it. So that's fun. So actually, my advice to people starting out, it would be in research I guess the whole PhD has really changed. If you go back 20 years, 20, 30 years, I mean, this is going to be an exaggeration, but the purpose of a PhD was professor replication, right? So you wanted to produce as many professors as, let's say, died that year, maybe with a little bit of margin, like 10% more for some attrition. So you'd produce, and then, so basically you'd train people so they would become professors, right? And then they would train people who would become professors. Okay. So, and in that area, from that mode, that's professor replication mode, you train people who are very narrow. I mean, they do just control, in fact, just one sliver of control, or they do, this one thing, or they do just like deep learning, just like that, okay? So, and then what they do is they write papers on deep learning, and they train their students to do deep learning, and then you have more deep learning professors, okay? So, but I think that's missing the picture. the new idea behind a PhD is when you end up being trained in just a handful of areas, you can now be unbelievably effective in 50 fields. If you know linear algebra, optimization, probability and statistics, computer science, and those are the topics. You don't have to know anything else. If you know those things and really know them, and if you have seen a bunch of applications in different wide fields, you are so valuable, it's crazy. You can be hired instantly into 100 fields, but here's the even cooler thing, and this is the Silicon Valley part of it. You can create new fields that don't even exist. And that's the main point. So my point there is please train yourself broadly. That is my point. Learn these things. You know, if your advisor works on X, topic X, of course you're going to work on topic X. When your advisor is not looking, go take other classes. Don't tell your advisor if you think it's going to upset your advisor. Because there are, yeah, I have to tell people, you're right? So I actually know people where their advisor yelled at them and said, what are you doing? But you can't take that class because you have to be doing research on, vertical cavity lasers. So if your advisor's like that, just don't tell them. And just go learn these things. Please, learn the math, learn the computer science. Go hang out with people doing machine learning and stuff like that. So make it broad. So that would be my best, because it's an incredibly exciting time, right? And please do more than just deep learning, to be very specific, right? That's great. It's just fine. It's great. But please, do other stuff or learn other stuff. Yeah.
Thank you for the great answers.
Yeah, thank you very much for excellent question and excellent answer. And I hope the audience, student, will tell the other student about this message. So please scatter this message to your colleagues somehow. Anyway, any other questions? Yes, there are many. So Professor Joe, you never asked any questions, so Dan Cho first.
I have a very simple question.
Yeah.
You left out physics.
Yeah, I did.
So, is that true?
Oh, I left out physics as, yes. Yeah, I think that for, you can flavorize what I was talking about. So if you want to do something like control or stuff at the physical layer, you're going to have to throw in physics, absolutely. So, but the core that I mentioned, which would be linear algebra, optimization, probability, computer science, that's sort of with an information science focus. But actually a beautiful other thing, another combination is you add those and you throw on some physics, and that's also a beautiful and wonderful background. And in fact, I'm very proud of the students who take my class whose background is basically things like devices and stuff like that. It's hard for them because it's not, it's a different language and stuff, and then they go on to do really cool stuff with it, so it's great. So yes, I should have specified that what I was sketching out was an information systems focus. You could add physics to it. By the way, here would be another thing. You could add to that, you could flavorize it with economics. And that would be a beautiful background to have, to know economics, linear, and then all the linear algebra stuff like that. That'd be another beautiful thing to have. Or it could be something in biology. So all of those are great. But no, I didn't mean to leave out physics, or I did only because I was sketching out an information science. I guess these are super fields now, right? Because they're bigger than actual departments and fields.
I also have one question, because nobody is asking about your talk today, so it should be some technical questions.
Sure.
So I was wondering, when you did in your example of L1 optimization, you actually didn't articulate the answer should be sparse. So you just changed it from L2 norm to L1 norm. So what is the insight or intuition why L1 norm optimization gives you the sparse solutions?
So I can explain that, or I can give a simple explanation. There are very fancy explanations too, but here's a simple one. If I have a square cost like this, then if you think about it, once something is small, then if it's squared, it's small squared, and that's very small. So the point is, there's no longer an incentive to make it smaller. I'm making this approximate, right? But if you have an L1 norm like this, if something is small, there's still a marginal incentive to make it smaller. So because of that, it actually pushes a whole bunch of these things to zero.
I see.
And it's really as simple as that. And there, you know, there's other functions that do that. Actually, you can make it even sparser, but it's not convex. So here's absolute value.
Okay,
And
so it's a scalable tool.
in a lot of image processing, people use an L.7 norm. It's not a norm, and that's something that goes like this. It goes up, but it curves outward like that, and it's even sharper.
I see.
And so there, in fact, as you get towards zero, not only do you still have the incentive to push towards zero, you have more incentive. And so that's not convex, but people use those, and that's it. So it's really that simple.
I see.
And I just wonder your opinion about the relationship between the convex optimization and learning-based optimization. And actually, I don't know about much about the machine learning or deep learning, but as far as I know, there has been huge advances in learning-based optimization, and it may make generic algorithm which come up with good solution with a huge amount of data. But on contrary, the convex optimization may be applied to relatively small area like resource allocation or power minimization. But we can make generic algorithm with the learning-based optimization. So what do you think about the future of convex optimization? The convex optimization is maybe replaced by the learning-based optimization?
That's a great question. You bring up some very, very big points there, right? So, so the first is I can tell you how I think of it. It's like, oh, okay. So I can tell you how I think of it. I actually think of it as something, it's no different from linear algebra or something like eigenvalues and singular values, right? These are generic things. If I asked you, well, what are the applications of singular values? Well, I don't know, because they're just used everywhere. It's just part of the infrastructure, right? And I actually feel like 10, 15 years from now, the same should be true for convex optimization. It should just be basic. Everybody should know it. Now, whether you should use a deep neural net to do resource allocation when we can solve it exactly in 50 microseconds, that seems to me to be a big mistake, and I'm actually quite certain it is. There are very good ways. So there are generalization, there's a trade-off between generality and what guarantees you have or how reliable it is and stuff like, and I said, sorry, generality and applicability, right? So you can get things that work on a lot of different things. They sort of work, but not really. So I think actually, so a lot of people, I know a lot of people who are doing end-to-end deep learning. I think in most cases, that's actually a big mistake. Because there's just parts of these things we know how to do. We know how to do resource allocation. For that matter, we know how to do control, right? So in fact, there is a very good ways for these things to work together. And that's simple. You do things, the deep learning would do things like either estimate or compute, make forecasts or predictions for things. And then the part that you can solve, the resource allocation you can solve exactly, you should, right? So I actually find it very difficult to believe, I guess this is here. So I can tell you exactly what's happening here, is that about 10 times a second, a complete trajectory is worked out from the current state to the landing pad. 10 times a second. Okay, it's a problem with about 600 variables and things like that, and it's run on some radiation-hardened processor, which is basically makes it a processor from the 1990s, right? You know what? You couldn't do this with, you actually couldn't do this with things like deep neural net. It would be a huge mistake. What you could do with that is all sorts of other stuff, good things you could do with it. The vision systems are great, all sorts of other stuff, but actually solving problems that we know how to solve exactly and well and perfectly, and using another method for it doesn't make any sense to me. So I'd recommend you learn both. In fact, I'm deeply suspicious when someone says, I do deep neural nets. I said, well, have you tried something like a support vector machine? And I will often get the answer, what's that? That's not good. Yeah, and it's not, so I'm not too impressed with that. And I think actually people are going to start figuring this out, right? I imagine pretty soon.
Okay, for the last, shall we do our homework right now so we can play the video?
Oh, this is your homework problem number 2. Okay, fine.
So let's do it right now.
For sure, that's fine. Usually you don't do the homework problem in class, but this is fine. Yeah. Which one are you? Oh, okay. All right. Oh, it's long enough that we could.
It's long enough. Maybe.
Yeah. No, it's okay. We'll. You could go.
It's just 1 minute and 47 minutes.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be too bad.
So there he is. So you look at there. Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. So. There you go. Good. There you go. So that was it. That was my student doing that. So, or rather, he didn't do it. That was all done.
Yes,
automatically.
actually, this is
So-
amazing because it looks like we are going backward. It looks like we are playing backward.
Yeah. Yeah, if you look at some of these carefully, some of them are pretty cool because it predicts winds. It has all sorts of LiDAR that's telling you about winds. And so it'll actually be coming in at a weird angle and not towards the pad. And everyone will go, oh, no, it's going to crash. And then at the very end, it'll just do that and go down. That's just, yeah. So there you go. It's fun. Okay.
Yes.
So,
okay, it's done.
good.
A couple of questions regarding
Sure.
real-time embedded optimization solver you
Sure.
mentioned in your lecture. It was Cvx Gen. At my first glance on that software, it looks like it can handle only 3,000 to 4,000
Yeah, that's right.
variables.
Right.
So it can handle only small size
Yeah.
QP representable problems. But my first question is, which part of the code generation poses the main difficulty in increasing the available size of the problem?
we wanted to go crazy, so we did something radically different. So we actually implemented our own, it's all linear algebra, all flat C. We did it ourselves. There's no real reason for that. And so there's no reason, although right now there's not a good one that exists, that you couldn't make a completely general, in fact, we're intending to do this in Python, right? So that you'll write a problem, and then you'll call the code gen method on a problem, and out will come flat C, but for anything, including problems that go much larger and things like that. So I could tell you why it is. It's because we do explicit factorization, but our loops are completely unrolled and everything. So but don't worry about that. It's just a small technical thing, and we could have made it work for much bigger.
Yeah. So my second question was.
Well,
Are there,
you have a second question?
yeah,
So-
is there
yeah, it should be
any?
quick.
Yeah,
I'm
but no,
sorry
it's a
about
tradition
Is
now.
there
We have two
any
questions.
plan
Yeah.
for potential upgrade to make it to enable it to handle more larger size
Yeah.
problems with Cvx Gen?
Oh, it would be extremely simple. All you have to do is pull out the linear algebra part and
okay.
plug in a different linear solver, and it will scale to very large things. Right.
Thank you very much.
By the way, I don't recommend doing that. I recommend waiting until we actually have good code generators. Then you can do it, but it would not be hard to do.
Okay, so time's up. And
Good.
I really thank you, Professor Stephen Boyd. Let's give him a big hand. Thank you very much.
Thank you.